Hi, this is the Philosophical Angle program, and I am your host, Chris Angle. I'm the author of 4 books on philosophy, one of which is the Philosophical Equations of Economics. The purpose of the Philosophical Angle is to examine the nature of concepts being used in current media. So, recently in current media, there's been much discussion about North Korea. In fact, there was a bomb scare over Hawaii. And so we're going to examine something about the nature of war. I think it's a pretty interesting topic. It needs to be discussed. And so let's start. We're going to let's start with the ingredients of that which makes war. And here are the ingredients. And by the way, the ingredients of that which makes war is also the ingredients of that which makes peace, because they're just the flip side of the same coin. They can go either way. The direction of the ingredients determines whether it's going toward peace or whether it's going toward war. So let's go and examine these ingredients. First of all, the very first ingredient, and the primary one, is the law of the unlimited demand for the good. And that is every life entity has the demand for more good in its life, and it's never ending. Even collectors, when they collect something like watches, pocket watches, they still like more because the additional one has an aesthetic appeal and that adds to their collection, and there's no limit to it because they appreciate it so much that they like to look at the beauty of it. And when people achieve wealth, more wealth adds to their goodness, and so they accept that wealth because there's a never-ending desire for that which benefits an individual life entity. And all we have to do is look inside ourselves to see that this is true. The next ingredient of our war is freedom. Freedom is a key ingredient to whether it's war or peace. And freedom is the creation of a priority, and then the effectuation of the priority. And a priority is a piece of knowledge that you assign in your mind to how you want to order your life. So when you order your life to say that, well, I like steak for dinner on Saturday nights, you place that as a priority to go down to the grocery store on Fridays and get yourself a piece of steak because you like it and you know that you're going to be hungry on Saturday, and so this is a high priority for you, and you establish these priorities, whether going from small priority up to a high priority, and this is how you order your lives. And the effectuation of that priority, the combination of creating it in your mind, adding it as a piece of knowledge to how you order your life, and then you go out and execute it. That's freedom. Now, freedom also is in conjunction with motivation. And this is the ratio of the sacrifice for everything you do. For example, you're going to go out to get steak on Saturday night, and you compare the sacrifice of going out to get it, to going down to the grocery store, relative to the reward of bringing it home, cooking it, and then putting it on your plate, and the reward is actually eating it, which is a great satisfaction. So your sacrifice, in order to make the decision whether you're going to execute within the frame of reference of freedom, whether you're going to execute your sacrifice to go down and get a steak, you match it up to the reward. And so that's called motivation. And in every decision we have, there's a degree of motivation that we have within that decision, which lies within freedom, which is in a background of the demand for that which is good, because you know that steak has a goodness for you. It's good in taste, it's good for nutrition, And so you perceive that goodness and you execute your decision, your sacrifice, to obtain that reward. And then another ingredient of war and peace is competition. And competition is the convergence and divergence of the priorities of two or more entities. So when we come back here and we take a look at our freedom, that we create our priorities, and we look at our motivation, comparing the priorities sacrifice with the expected reward. And then if somebody else has that same sacrifice reward on their mind, in other words, by two or more entities, you have competition. And what I mean by convergence and divergence of the priorities, if the convergence is when the sacrifice by two or more entities converge on one another. In other words, let's say you're going to go down into the grocery store and buy a steak, and there's only one left there. And two people arrive there, and they both want steak. So there's a little bit of competition to grab that steak. In other words, to get down there first to be able to get it. So, but then you have the divergence. And divergence is when you see that you have competition. All life entities know that is inimical to their health to be in direct convergence of their priorities with others, because you have to compete. You're competing for the same priority. So you try to get away from that. You try to diverge. You differentiate. So let's say I know that I've got that steak down there, and there are other people that want it. So I might have to go to a different grocery store. So I diverge and go to another grocery store to diverge from direct competition. Now you can see this in the marketplace. Every time that you walk into a drugstore, you go up to the toothpaste rack, and it's got a lot of different items there. There are all sorts of toothpaste, all the way from the cheap all the way to very high, and to the more expensive. And within that price range, they've got various types, one that are whitening, and one that make your breath feel fresh, or one that does this and that. And what's happening here is that companies are subject to the convergence and divergence of the priorities of their customers. So I'm being a customer, I'm in front of the toothpaste rack. I see that I'm diverging onto the company's priorities to make a tube of toothpaste for me. And so other companies are doing it also. So in order for the other companies to attract my eye, they diverge, they make a differentiation of their product to catch my eye, and maybe the new facets that are in their particular product will attract my eye, and I will go to that product. All companies do it, especially if you look at car manufacturers. Look at how many car manufacturers have entered the world market, because the world market's so vast. And so companies have entered it, and they converge on the same marketplace, the world market for cars, but they diverge in that they produce many different types of cars to attract the eye of the buyer. So when competition reigns free, divergence is allowed. If there's have freedom for divergence of the priorities, you have peace, as long as divergence is permitted. And if divergence is not permitted, you get convergence, and convergence is the opposite direction, and that would be toward war or toward conflict. And that's what happens when two companies converge on the same priority, and it's direct competition and the convergence. You have economic war. If the two products are exactly the same. But life entities know that they don't want direct competition, so they diverge from that automatically. So this produces the law of differentiation. divergence from the market priorities, fulfilling new demand to deliver new goodness. And that's because all these facets that are produced by these companies, they do it with the mind of producing an additional piece of goodness, whether it's at a lower price or whether it has an additional facet to it that allows it to be even more useful to the buyer. They do this by creating new knowledge, and from competition and the law of differentiation comes the need for cooperation, which is the need to produce the goods and services that produces all the goodness in the products that they bring to market through the law of differentiation, through divergence from the market priorities, which is produced by competition. And cooperation produces peace. And the reverse order of not allowing competition, not allowing the differentiation, can produce war. And so why did I say cooperation? Cooperation happens because there's two types of cooperation. One from the buyer and the seller, offering the product, accepting the product, delivering your money, and that's one competition. And the other type of cooperation. The other type of cooperation is from the internal cooperation of the companies that produce the goodness. People cooperate with inside the companies to produce goods and services, and they cooperate together and produce a great product and for the consumer. Okay, so let's now go to the and see what happens in the creation of any war. There are two starting points: the law of the unlimited demand for the good, which we explained up here, and freedom. Freedom exists in society, for example, Western societies, but freedom does not exist within other societies such as North Korea. And when freedom exists, a marketplace exists for people to generate goods and services, creating goodnesses in a society, because goods and services are essentially good because they're created with the perception that this is good for somebody, and buyers buy it because they perceive that what they're buying is going to be good for them and it's going to improve their lives. And as we know, buyers have the unlimited demand for the good. So when freedom is depreciated, the vehicle of depreciation through exterior coercion, such as through taxation, regulations, laws, and by the way, laws are anti-knowledge, and anti-knowledge plus coercion equals a loss of freedom. And we can go through a history of wars, and such as the American Revolution, and we can see that this is actually what fomented the occurrence of some wars in the past. But the trade-off of some freedom for the protection of government is necessary. Therefore, total freedom is just about impossible unless it's run by perfect individuals, and we're not angels, as I think was Madison in one of the Federalist Papers said that hey, we wouldn't need government if men were angels, but so we're not. So we need government, and with government comes coercion, or the ability to coerce, with its production of laws and regulations. But some laws and regulations are needed so society can function. So the intensity of competition, if the intensity of competition is less, and thus divergence is less, therefore production of goods would be less if too many laws and regulations are installed within a society. Enter the law of unlimited demand for the good. Life entities have a continuous desire for all that is good for oneself, your mate, and your progeny. So the loss of goodness is sorrowful and is resentful. So if you have an intensity of competition, or competition is less, allowing less divergence and less freedom, if laws and regulations are creating an atmosphere where there is less competition, where there's less freedom and less divergence to go out and create new products, you are not able to fulfill the demand for the good which life entities continuously want. And the loss of this goodness is sorrowful and resented if caused by others. And so you often see it. You get resentment of the government or anybody who produces coercion upon your marketplace of goods and services that are being provided to you. So if the loss of goodness for an individual is caused by another, resentment appears, whether it's government or other individuals or other companies, and there appears there appears the potential for a fight. And if the loss of goodness is endured by a nation due to the actions of another nation, a potential for war increases. Hey, look what happened to Germany in World War I, and when the British blockaded them. Germany wasn't allowed to go out and buy food from overseas markets. So it's competition to buy food, and freedom to buy food was interdicted by the British blockade, and look what happened. You had war. So so let's go back to our chart here. So even though the potential for war rises in order for war to precipitate into a reality, another ingredient appears, and that's motivation, which we talked about. And motivation is the ratio of the sacrifice versus the reward. The less the sacrifice relative to the reward, the greater probability of the sacrifice to occur. And so now let's just go over one more time the chart of ingredients for war and peace. One, it's freedom, and freedom in the marketplace. It's the law of the unlimited demand for the good. It's allowing competition, the convergence and divergence to occur within the marketplace, and which happens because of the law of differentiation. And of course the motivation that happens when we initiate priorities. So let's take a look at what's happening when we opened up this talk about war. We mentioned North Korea. It's kind of the bad boy of the international war scene. And what is the potential of war here for Korea, for North Korea? Well, internationally, North Korea, it does enter the international market with its production of its slave labor, its production of coal and weaponry, and thus it does have some peaceful cooperative agreements, and it does have some peace between themselves and its customers for these products. But outside of those with whom it deals, outside of its small customer base, which is really only other totalitarian regimes, it doesn't have any competitive and cooperative relationships. And no cooperation means no peace. And we should remember about what Frederick Bastiat said about this. He said, when goods do not cross borders, armies will. And so we see that our theory here is commensurate with Bastiat. So the totalitarian regime will typically employ stealing that which they do not have, such as advanced knowledge and technology, because they're not as cooperative with others on the international scene, and they're not also allowing within its country the convergence and divergence of for the freedom of the individuals within their countries. So they're not. So the individuals within these countries do not produce as much knowledge and technology as other countries' individuals. So in a totalitarian, and because of that, they have a depreciation or a lack of production of knowledge, and because of that, they look to steal it outwardly, and thus the history of international espionage often has historically been the stealing of knowledge by totalitarian dictators, and because of their little differentiation and divergence, and it has typically very little cooperation with its citizenry, and the production of knowledge is less in a free society because free societies produce more knowledge and cooperation, and the cooperation is more extensive, which is again produced by the competition, and which contains the differentiation and divergence that we spoke about. So because North Korea dictatorship does not produce cooperation as much as free societies, it must rely on coercion. And therefore, North Korea is unethical, as North Korea is an ideologically driven totalitarian society. And there are some totalitarian societies that maybe do not fit in this situation because they are not politically ideologically driven like North Korea, but only economically driven, and cooperation within those type of a totalitarian society may produce a good living for their constituents, and cooperation that country may have a free market, and therefore its cooperation may be good. But I don't see many of this type of totalitarian societies in history. They're almost non-existent. So we can conclude that North Korea is unethical because its ethics is the appropriate, and yes, so we should tell you that the definition of any type of ethical behavior is the appropriate dispensation of respect. We can talk more about that in other lectures. Therefore, North Korea or any totalitarian regime employs a non-ethical philosophy of the ends justifies the means. And therefore, when you have ends justifies the means as its philosophy in which it looks at its own citizens, North Korea then becomes steeped in an internal war, and revolt is possible if the people had any sort of means by which they could go to revolution, but the government has the control of all of production and all of weaponry, and so it's impossible. North Korea is at war with its citizenry. It is a totalitarian, authoritarian command society, and as we know, there's no competition and no divergence, and thus little competition between one government and the citizenry. It is a unilateral operation, and the contract with the people is that the ruler and his Praetorian Guard get most of the production, and the peasants get very little. But due to the law of demand for the good goes, in this case, to the ruler and his Praetorian Guard, because they want as much good to come to their lives as possible, as we've seen with the law of the unlimited demand for the good. So if there's no cooperation and potential, the potential for a war is high, but as we mentioned, the government is cognizant of this potential, and therefore they preclude any possession of weaponry by the peasants. So what they have to do is they have to replace this demand for the good with a fear that a fear for their lives, and a fear from an outward aggression by countries outside of their society in order for them to even continue and function as a society. So, so as we mentioned, because of the non-cooperation by North Korea or any other totalitarian, politically, ideologically driven dictatorship, they are behind free societies technologically and behind in their standards. But we must not forget that the law of the unlimited demand for the good applies to all of life, including the North Korean totalitarian regime as a nation, which will also want more goodness to flow in their direction. Also, although the potential for war with North Korea exists because of the law of unlimited demand for good, it is small because of the factor we have enumerated in the causes of war, motivation, the ratio of the sacrifice versus the reward. When the sacrifice is large, which is to go to war with the U.S., and when the sacrifice is dangerous, which is to suffer the might of the U.S. armed forces, yet the reward is commensurately small, what they would gain from such a war, there really would be a small probability that North Korea would initiate a war with the motivation such as it is. So we're gonna talk about a couple of examples. One, if we talk about ideological war, where one ideology takes over by force, which is common because of radical leftists have typically used coercion throughout the 1900s. Look at the Soviet Union in 1917 when the Democratic Parliament of Alexander Kerensky was crushed by Lenin and his armed thugs. Vietnam, Germany, the Nazi Party was a socialist party. In fact, that's what the Nazi stands for. And they disbanded the rights of the individual and took control of the government by an emergency declaration, and so freedom was diminished. And look what happened there when freedom was diminished. Freedom was diminished here. Freedom was diminished here, and these societies tend to break out and cause war. Not only intranationally, but internationally. They not only go to war with the people of their own country, but they end up going to war outside of their country, especially Germany, and including the Soviet Union. It went to war with, in response to, of course, Germany, but also after it tried to accumulate all of Eastern Europe, and it did accumulate it. So, in general, entities do not like competition, but competition is great because it causes diversification through divergence. But the left wants to eliminate divergence, which is typical of the left. As we've seen in these situations, they were all leftist regimes, and it wants to eliminate differentiation, which causes an increase, which causes increases of knowledge and inventions and other things that are produced by human creative character. And the left wants this because the left works to create an equality in outcome. And the left does this by coercion, and it does it by coercion through government. And they need to do this because the left believes that others are bad. And because others are bad, they need governments through regulations and laws or whatever to be imposed upon the individual. And when they impose upon the individual, of course, there's a loss of freedom. And coercion, and this coercion that the leftists use by the government creates or eliminates creativity, because the differentiation of within competition is eliminated, And with the elimination of the creativity through the elimination of the differentiation, that can cause a war too. So let's go here to a summary and in the causes of the war, of any kind of war. You have, let's take a look here. Right. Okay, so you have a leftist government versus the people, such as the Soviet Union, North Korea, all the communist governments. The consumer, the consumer, the leftist government fights the consumer in the free markets. And war can be caused by the elimination of this competition, and you have internal revolt, and thus the elimination of divergence and coercion. And the elimination of the convergence through coercion by the government means the elimination of the divergence or the differentiation and the potential for goodness. If there's little possible potential for goodness, the potential for revolution increases because of the people's motivation to achieve goodness is present, and motivation is the sacrifice versus the reward. Therefore, the government will take away the means to war, and because it knows that this is a possibility, and so it'll take away the means to the war. So all governments, such as leftist governments, will try to eliminate the populace owning guns, and such as Stalin, Mao, Pol Pot, even in the United States, the leftists tried to get rid of the guns that are inhabited in the hands of the people. And in this situation, the government is at war with the people, and we'll talk about this more later in other episodes. So situation number 2, where an economic entity versus the people, the consumer versus the free market. So an economic entity versus the people, the consumer, and the free market. So something like Ford or General Motors, when there's versus the people or the few through its versus its consumer. The full competition and thus the full differentiation through divergence. If it's eliminated, you get a monopoly, and this produces a high. So if allowed, competition's allowed, this produces a high potential for the production of goods and services. And this situation produces little conflict because it increases the potential for cooperation, and cooperation means peace. And you have competition. When you have competition, you have cooperation between the buyer and the seller. And it also, if you have full competition, it also allows some cooperation between producers, because if you allow full differentiation, then companies are allowed to try and steer away from direct competition. And so if you have a monopoly where it's one company dominating a marketplace, it eliminates the competition. It's eliminated the competition, and thus differentiation starts to decrease because it doesn't have any competition to cause it to differentiate and create that new knowledge with the new products. Another ideological situation is the government versus government. This situation is where those types of governments are democratic and thus freedom oriented. In what we're going to discuss, and when that happens, you get a peaceful situation. Look at Western Europe; they're all democratic, and so there's peace between all of them, and that happens because the ingredients of war or the ingredients of peace are all in place. So as there is freedom, there is a market of ideas, and thus there is competition of ideas, and thus a differentiation of new ideas, and thus there's no motivation to war. Democracy is inherently peaceful because of the innate differentiation of ideas that occurs because everybody's allowed to make an input. So another situation is consumer versus consumer, which is the individual versus the individual inside a free market. And when competition exists, there's absolutely no potential for war. So that's it for today. So let's go right back and just review the ingredients again for the cause of war and the cause of peace. First, it's the unlimited demand for the good within a society that allows for freedom, and that freedom allows for competition, and competition produces a convergence, a divergence, which produces knowledge and cooperation. And this is all done through the motivation. All these individual decisions that are made in freedom, in the free marketplace, are also subject to the risk-reward ratio. The sacrifice versus the reward ratio. So when the sacrifice is small and the reward is seen as potentially high, you have a great potential for the execution of the decisions that are made inside a free marketplace. So thanks for joining me, and if you have any questions, email me at chrisangle1@gmail.com. Thanks for participating.